Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Today's episode is about the most significant figure in Irish 20th century history. Eamon de Valera had a public life that spanned 60 years, from his joining of the Irish Volunteers in 1913 until his retirement from the Irish presidency in 1973. He had important roles to play in many of the most consequential events and decisions affecting Ireland for the entire period, from the Easter Rising to the Treaty on Independence to Irish neutrality during the Second World War. As my guest and I discuss today, such longevity in a career inevitably leads to opposition. Some Irish nationalists deride the backseat role de Valera played in negotiating with the British government for Irish independence in 1921, and Irish neutrality, in the context of the war in Ukraine, is coming increasingly under question. Moreover, some have attempted to paint de Valera as a pious and cold individual, who characterised an era of cultural stagnation when the newly independent Ireland was under the thumb of the all-powerful Catholic Church. Whilst there is legitimate debate about the nature of the country that de Valera created, there can be little debate that he knew the type of country he wanted to create. He had a vision for Ireland and created a strong consensus around various issues in the new independent republic. This can at least in part account for the long-standing stability in a country that was far from stable at its inception. My guest today is Diarmaid Ferriter. Diarmaid is a professor of modern Irish history at University College Dublin and has written almost a dozen books on Ireland, including Judging Dev, a reassessment of the life and legacy of Eamon de Valera. I recorded this as the recent recipient of an Irish passport. So now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce my fellow countryman, Eamon de Valera. Hi Diarmaid, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Good to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you too. We're talking about Eamon de Valera today, Diarmaid. He was born in 1882 in New York. His mother was Irish, but his father was Hispanic. I use that term because it's kind of disputed exactly where his father was from. Some people have said he was Spanish, others have said he was Cuban. When Eamon de Valera was 2, he was taken to Ireland by his uncle. Given his multinational background, how would you characterise his conception of being Irish in his youth? What set him on the route to being the very committed Irish nationalist he would become?
Well, there was an insult that was thrown at him at one stage at the height of his political powers that he was the Spanish onion in the Irish stew. And it was a deliberate attempt to try and stir this controversial issue of his background. And he was sensitive about it, there's no doubt about that. It may have reinforced his notion of himself as intrinsically Irish. You know, he may have been slightly defensive about it. He used to say he was reared in a labourer's cottage in Limerick. He was talking about his grandmother's cottage. And he wanted to emphasize that he was racy of the soil, you know, that he had come from humble origins. It's his version of, you know, the Abraham Lincoln log cabin. And, you know, there's a bit of exaggeration in that, you know, in relation to the comfort of the circumstances. But it was, you know, a humble enough abode. And he did like to emphasize the importance of having a feel for rural Ireland, of being able to voice the concerns of the small farming class. And of course, he built much capital out of that subsequently. So in that sense, that background in Limerick, that move to Limerick as a young child was a very important one for him. You know, the American links remain crucial too, as they were to Irish nationalism generally. And certainly Eamon de Valera made much of his trips to the United States and the importance of that Irish-American connection. But he's very much rooted in the idea of voicing that sense of an Irishness that is very much equated with rural Ireland and very much equated with a strong sense of self-sufficiency, not just in the political sense, but in the cultural sense. And, when you look at, his main political aims, one of them was about restoring the Irish language as the everyday language of the people. So he made much of that.
Ireland was still a colony of the British Empire when de Valera was a child. And as he sort of became an adult, the issue of Irish Home Rule, alongside women's suffrage, was probably the largest political issue in Britain in the years, preceding the First World War. And de Valera, in the year before World War I started, joined the Irish Volunteers. Who were the Irish Volunteers?
The Irish Volunteers were established in 1913, and that was a reaction to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers. The Ulster Volunteer Force was established in early 1913, and this was the militant phase of Ulster Unionist opposition to Home Rule, to being dragged in, as they saw it, against their will, to an all-island Home Rule entity. And the Irish nationalist reaction to that was to form the Irish Volunteers in order to defend the idea of Home Rule and ensure its implementation. And the emphasis from Eoin MacNeill, its Chief of Staff, was that they were not going to be an aggressive force, that they were there to protect the idea of the integrity of the Home Rule quest. And the First World War changed everything. I mean, Eamon de Valera joined the Irish Volunteers in 1913. That was really his entry to public life. And it was one of the great causes of 1913 in Ireland, but there are many others. There are an awful lot of ingredients that go into the melting pot in Ireland on the eve of the First World War. You mentioned suffrage there, that's one of them. But also the labour question was a big question in Ireland in 1913. So all of these different ingredients go into the melting pot. And the First World War really changes everything. And of course, there were those who would have considered themselves ardent home rulers who are pushed to more militant politics. And Eamon de Valera ultimately becomes associated with the cause of the Irish Republic as it is enunciated in 1916 through the 1916 rebellion against British rule in Ireland. But what the First World War did to the Irish Volunteers was split it between those who followed John Redmond, the constitutional nationalist, the leader of the constitutional nationalists at Westminster, who wanted the Irish Volunteers to enlist in the British Army, as many did, to fight with the Ulster Volunteer Force, because many of the Ulster Volunteers, of course, enlisted in the British Army as well. John Redmond had this idea that this would bring them closer and therefore would bring the idea of political union in Ireland closer. But it split the Irish Volunteers because there were those, a small minority, who wanted nothing to do with the war effort. And they went down a different path, and Eamon de Valera would have been with that particular branch of the Volunteers.
During the First World War, of course, there was a particular event in Ireland which was especially significant, and that was the Easter Rising of 1916. It's come to be seen in retrospect as a kind of turning point for the fight for Irish independence. For people who don't know what happened, can you explain briefly this event and set up de Valera's role in it?
Well, those who organised the 1916 Rising were members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which dated back from the late 1850s in both Ireland and America. It had Irish and American branches. The Fenian movement, as it became known, this was a secret, oath-bound, clandestine organisation. They were organised in cells, highly secretive, and they saw an opportunity with the First World War to try and infiltrate the Irish Volunteers and to try and foment plans for a rebellion in a very secretive way. It involved a lot of deception. Eamon de Valera wouldn't have been comfortable with the Irish Republican Brotherhood as an oath-bound organisation. He would have had a difficulty with his conscience around that, as did others. But the idea was that they would mobilise the volunteers on the pretext that they were drilling on Easter Sunday, and then they would be informed that there was a rebellion planned and to take part in that. It was supposed to be an all-island affair. But in the event, the deception was discovered by Eoin MacNeill, who was the Chief of Staff of the Irish Volunteers, and he issued a countermand order, which led to the postponement of the rising by one day. But they went ahead on Easter Monday, a relatively small group, in the region of 1,500 people involved in that, for example, in Dublin over the course of what became nearly a week-long rebellion. They took over certain key buildings in the city centre. They didn't have a sophisticated military plan. And in many ways, it was staged in a very dramatic way. A lot of those who were involved in planning the rising were from the cultural worlds. They were poets, they were dreamers, they were idealistic, they were emboldened by the First World War. De Valera didn't really fit into that camp. He was a bit more hard-headed. But nonetheless, he believed, as did like-minded individuals, that if this plan had been advanced and there was an opportunity to demonstrate this disgust they had at British imperialism in Ireland, that they needed to grasp it and do the best that they could. And it really was the foundational moment of the modern Irish Republic. I mean, it was doomed to failure in the military sense, but they were really seeking to light a spark that would ultimately generate a greater fire. And that's exactly what happened, because the British government, understandably, in the conditions of the war, responded by executing the leaders. This was highly treasonous activity, obviously. And there was a change in public opinion. The rising wasn't popular in 1916. I mean, the conditions for rebellion did not exist as far as most people were concerned in 1916. But the longer the war went on, and that combined with the British government's reaction and the execution of the leaders and the arrest of both those who had been involved and those who were suspected of involvement but hadn't had any involvement, that did change opinion. And the following year, 1917, is really about building political capital out of the legacy of the 1916 rising. And the crucial point here, of course, is that Eamon de Valera wasn't executed. And that is one of the big what-ifs of the career of Eamon de Valera. The leaders of the 1916 rising who were executed were those deemed to be the ringleaders. De Valera wasn't in that particular category. He wasn't particularly well known. But ultimately, he became, after 1917, 1918, the sole surviving commandant of the 1916 rising. That gave him a particular status. He was a couple of years older than many of the other participants, so he had a seniority in age as well. And by the time he was imprisoned after the 1916 rising, he is the person that Republicans are looking to.
After the First World War had finished, there was a general election in the UK about a month after the armistice of November 18. And Sinn Féin, which was De Valera's political party, won a massive victory in Ireland. I think they won 73 seats of 105 in Ireland. Sinn Féin, of course, didn't take their seats in the Westminster Parliament. They still don't now. And they formed their own parliament in Dublin, the Dáil, and declared Ireland unilaterally, really, to be an independent republic. This, of course, set Ireland on a collision course with London, with the UK. And the next sort of 2.5 years are taken up by a fairly bloody war of independence. What was the result of that conflict?
The result of that conflict ultimately was a ceasefire in July 1921 and dialogue, negotiations between representatives of Sinn Féin and the British government. The British government discovered that it could not defeat the Irish Republican IRA, which is what the Irish Volunteers had evolved into particularly after 1918 into 1919. It was now styled as the Irish Republican Army, and they engaged in a very effective form of warfare, guerrilla warfare. And whilst they could not defeat Britain, stalemate had been reached by the summer of 1921. And the British government was getting increasingly more embarrassed and shamed by the war in Ireland, because it had maintained it could contain its Irish problem. It wouldn't give it the legitimacy of a war, but it was causing increasing international embarrassment. And Ireland, of course, was something that had, as you mentioned, convulsed British politics during the Home Rule crisis of 1912 to 1914. They didn't want that to happen again, so they were seeking to try and get the Irish question off the table of Downing Street. And David Lloyd George, as British Prime Minister, was leading a coalition government which consisted of hawks and doves, but he was also pragmatic enough to know that if he could cut a deal that would get the Irish question out of British politics, that it would do his legacy no harm at all. But the big controversy of that era is De Valera's absence from those negotiations. He's the president of Sinn Féin. He is the self-styled president of the Irish Republic, but he doesn't attend the negotiations. Now, he does send Arthur Griffith, the original founder of the Sinn Féin movement, and Michael Collins, who, of course, had been the chief wanted man from a British perspective during the War of Independence, because he was director of intelligence for the IRA, but he was also a senior Sinn Féin minister. That was a hugely controversial decision, because De Valera was the experienced statesman. He'd spent a year and a half in the United States raising awareness about the cause of the Irish Republic during the War of Independence. He had met David Lloyd George himself, Eamon de Valera, after the ceasefire of July 1921, one-on-one meetings. So he had the measure of David Lloyd George. But De Valera's argument was that he needed to remain at home as the untainted symbol of the Republic, and that if things went wrong, he would be... they would have recourse to him, and that it was better for him, as he put it at the time, not to be tainted by the London atmosphere. But that was a gamble that didn't work out well for Eamon de Valera, because the compromise that was reached by December 1921 was one that created a free state for the 26 counties of Southern Ireland. Ireland had already been partitioned. Ulster Unionists had already got their own six-county state of Northern Ireland. The aim of Sinn Féin was to try and undo that and achieve a republic. And of course, a free state, which would be a dominion of the British Empire, fell well short of that. And the negotiators came back with the agreement signed, and De Valera was furious.
This is the famous treaty, of course, of December 1921. And the result of that treaty, the kind of political fallout of it, is that Ireland descends into a civil war in 1922 and 23 between supporters of the treaty, which, as you said, gave dominion status to the Irish Free State, essentially turning it into a kind of member of the Commonwealth that would still have been under the dominion of the king, versus anti-treaty people that were against the treaty, who wanted Ireland to be a genuine republic, perhaps in similar ways to a country like the Bahamas has recently done in sort of totally extricating itself from British dominion. De Valera was obviously against that treaty. He was on the anti-treaty side. What were his sort of personal reasons for being a kind of fully fledged Republican rather than advocating for dominion status?
Well, he wasn't a fully fledged Republican, and you see, that's where we have to be nuanced about Eamon de Valera. I mean, he was, in the sense that rhetorically, he was adamant that what was needed was an Irish Republic. But what he was proposing really was a third way between the treaty and outright opposition to it. What he was proposing was the notion of external association. That Ireland, because of its geographical closeness to Britain, because Britain was a much bigger and more powerful neighbour, would cooperate with Britain when it came to external defence, but would not be a member of the Commonwealth, and that he was prepared to recognise the British Crown for defence purposes as head of that Commonwealth, but that Ireland would not be in the Commonwealth. Now, that distinction was lost on a lot of his contemporaries, and you can see why, for understandable reasons, that the distinction was just too fine. But in a way, De Valera was falling between two stools, because he was not regarded as green enough for some of the more militant anti-treatyites in the IRA. And many in the IRA distrusted politicians anyway. De Valera was primarily a politician throughout his career. And, there was a disdain on the part of many of the anti-treatyites in the IRA for politicians anyway. So this is the most difficult part of his career. He also, of course, did not accept the vote of the Irish Parliament, of the Dáil. Having said that he would accept its decision, the vote in favour of the treaty was 64 votes to 57 against. It was very tight. The treaty split the country, split the Sinn Féin movement. Individual families and communities were split by it. So it was nationally a very divisive issue. De Valera is in hiding for much of the Civil War, and he's despairing and he's losing control. And this is the crucial point about Eamon de Valera. He was determined never to lose control again. But his primary reasons were that the treaty represented too much of a compromise, And the hated part of the treaty was an oath of allegiance or fidelity to the British Crown that had to be sworn by Irish parliamentarians. And you can understand that that would have stuck in the throat of many of that generation.
Obviously, the pro-treaty forces won a military victory against the anti-treatyites, of whom de Valera was a significant one, although not in it's difficult to say his total commitment to that. The anti-treatyites hadn't won on the battlefield, but what was the split within the 26 counties itself? Do we have any idea of the strength of public feeling on either side of that dispute within, out in the sticks?
We do, in the sense that there was a general election in June 1922. So over 6 months after the treaty had been signed, and pro-treaty candidates did much better than anti-treaty candidates. But also the Labour Party did very well. One of their best electoral results, because there was an appetite for bread and butter issues. I mean, there were serious social and economic problems. There had been something of a boom for agricultural Ireland during the First World War because of the demands that existed for its produce, but that had long dissipated, so unemployment was a serious problem. Many people were not getting convulsed with rows about what were regarded as quite abstract issues, the oath of allegiance and constitutional questions. So there's quite an appetite there for a return to normality and bread and butter debate. So we do have the election results of June 1922 to give us some indication of the extent to which the country was split. But the Civil War, which breaks out at the very end of that month in June 1922, that really polarizes the communities and the politicians, and it kind of squeezes Labour out as a kind of a third way or a third voice, and people become very entrenched as anti-treaty or pro-treaty. So we can get a strong sense during that period of a country that's really divided according to Civil War loyalties. And of course that feeds into politics for decades afterwards. I mean, the two political parties that came to dominate Irish politics, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, ultimately were born out of the Civil War divisions. But De Valera's difficulty at the end of the Civil War is not just defeat for the anti-treatyites, but what he does with Sinn Féin, because Sinn Féin is still in existence. Obviously, there's a pro-treaty Sinn Féin and anti-treaty Sinn Féin. The pro-treaty Sinn Féin styles itself now as Cumann na Gael. The anti-treaty Sinn Féin is abstaining from the Irish Parliament. And De Valera regards that as a political cul-de-sac, which is the reason why he formed a new political party, Fianna Fáil, or Warriors of Destiny, in 1926, which goes on to become one of the most successful political parties in the world. De Valera realised that if he wanted to vindicate his ambitions to achieve an Irish Republic, he would have to do it in a non-Sinn Féin context, that he would have to build a new political force.
De Valera's career is so long; it's difficult to kind of squeeze it into the time that we have. So forgive me for kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but De Valera ended up serving as Taoiseach, which is, for people listening, the Irish name for Prime Minister. He ended up serving 3 times over a period of 22 years. Ireland did end up leaving the Commonwealth in 1948, at a time when Britain was kind of withdrawing from much of the rest of its empire post World War II. Something that's quite striking, though, is that in a lot of anti-colonial politics, much of the reasoning for colonial subjects for wanting to leave the British Empire was that they wanted, as well as political independence and cultural independence you mentioned earlier, a kind of economic sovereignty and independence as well. And this often gave anti-colonial movements a kind of left-wing economic outlook. What do you think De Valera's conception of Ireland's economic future was?
Well, the vast majority of De Valera's economic thinking, and that wasn't huge. He didn't devote a huge amount of time to economic thinking. But the time that he did devote to it was very much bound up with the future of the Irish agricultural economy and agricultural self-sufficiency. Ireland was not an industrialised society. Most of the industry in Ireland was located in the north of the country, which now, of course, was the new Northern Ireland. over half of the Irish workforce are engaged in agriculture. So the economic ideals are articulated in the context of the future of rural Ireland. And De Valera comes to power. It's a remarkable comeback, really, in 1932. He comes to power less than 10 years after the end of the Civil War, but also in the context of the great economic crash of the late 1920s. So it is an era of protectionism, building up tariff walls, the idea of self-sufficiency and the idea of self-reliance, and lessening the dependence on imports from Britain in particular. So he wants to build up the small farm economy. Now that doesn't go according to plan. In the sense that Ireland is still hugely dependent on the importation of British materials for its agricultural industry. But he also wants to develop a domestic manufacturing sector. And there is a kind of a protected national bourgeoisie that emerges as a result of these economic policies, and a significant amount of jobs were created because they had a monopoly on the production of certain goods. So some people did well out of this. But there's also a welfare dimension. I mean, you mentioned the left-wing idea there. In many respects, the early Fianna Fáil party stole the political clothes of the Labour Party. There was more active state intervention than there had been in the 1920s. They built a lot more houses in the 1930s in particular, in both urban and rural areas, which built a kind of a bedrock of support for Fianna Fáil in those areas. So they really are the priorities. And there is a lot of emphasis on the idea that class politics don't apply to Ireland, because Ireland isn't an industrialised society. Ireland is not like Britain. It's not an urban society. It's a rural society. Now, there's a degree of myth in that idea that class distinctions don't exist in Ireland. But, that's the part of the reason for the success of Fianna Fáil, is that they portray themselves as a national movement rather than a political party. And ultimately, we know from the first kind of modern data crunching that was done in the late 1960s that Fianna Fáil managed to actually appeal to the three socio-economic categories that were identified equally. No other political party could match that. So De Valera's Fianna Fáil managed to appeal to those who felt they had little stake in the country, those who did have a stake in the country, and those who had a significant stake in the country. And you've got to remember, the first period in power is 16 years, 1932 to 1948. It's an extraordinary dominance, and it earns the label De Valera's Ireland, such as his political dominance. But he is also prioritising Anglo-Irish relations and foreign policy. He takes on that role himself. As well as being Prime Minister, he's also Minister for External Affairs. And he rips up the treaty over the course of the 1930s. And that generates a lot of positivity towards him, particularly those who had become disgruntled with the politics of the 1920s and Cumann and Gael. But also for those who come to politics for the first time in the 1930s, they're attracted to his brand of politics. And he negotiates very successfully with the British government. And his ultimate endpoint in foreign policy is the capacity to implement an independent foreign policy. In other words, neutrality in the event of global conflicts, as happens in 1939. And De Valera manages to guide Ireland through that Second World War period. It was called the emergency in Ireland. Of course, nobody knew in 1939 how long it was going to last, and it was a tightrope that he had to walk. And yet, it wasn't an absolute neutrality. Ireland's neutrality, of course, was very weighted in favour of the Allies, but in a very clandestine way. The public emphasis is on the purity of Irish neutrality. The private reality is very, very different. But what matters from De Valera's perspective is that Ireland is seen to go its own way in the midst of an international conflict. And that feeds in to his sense of the evolution of Irish nationalism and a distinctive Irish foreign policy. It's hugely important to him.
The fact that Ireland eventually became a republic, and the fact that De Valera negotiated to kind of get rid of the 22 treaty. Do you think that that's something that you can attribute mostly to De Valera's political skill? Or do you think ultimately it's more a reflection of the increasing weakness of Britain through the 1930s and ultimately to the point where it was decolonising everywhere across the world, and that was a weakness that it hadn't been exhibiting in the same way in the early 1920s?
You could say it's a combination of both, but a larger part of it, I think, is down to Eamon de Valera's skill and the fact that he had a vision. Eamon de Valera knew exactly where he wanted to take the country, and this is the crucial point. He had a lot of time to nurse his thoughts. Particularly, he spends nearly a year in prison. He's imprisoned by the Free State government in 1923. He's an awful lot of time for reflection, and he has to reflect on where he went wrong during the War of Independence and Civil War period, but also to think about where he wants to go politically. And this is the way De Valera strategizes. And he articulates a very coherent vision about where he wants to take Ireland. And that is put into practice in the 1930s. And he is very skillful in how he manages that and in how he communicates it to the public. And he generates a degree of pride in it. And that culminates, you could argue, in his famous put down of Winston Churchill, who in his drunken, sneering way in 1945 during his victory speech poured scorn on little neutral Ireland, frolicking with the German and the Japanese to their heart's content. And De Valera was canny enough not to throw petrol on the fire, and he waited a few days and then responded in a very dignified way about the rights of small nations to go their own way, and that chimed with the way the Irish people were feeling. So, he had that sense of where he wanted to take the country and how he wanted to express its independence. But when it came to the nitty-gritty of negotiations, that's where his skill came in also during the 1930s. De Valera finds himself in London, and, there are tricky moments, obviously, and there's the change of guard in British politics. But he's not successful in everything. I mean, there is an open sore, which is the partition of Ireland. And Fianna Fáil's foundational aim is to end the partition of Ireland, and they don't manage it. De Valera doesn't have an answer to partition other than Britain has imposed it and Britain must undo it. It's not a very sophisticated argument, and of course it's debatable whether partition was ever that simple. So there really is a Cold War between North and South from the 1920s onwards, which really isn't thawed until the late 1950s. So in that sense, De Valera is found wanting when it comes to a solution to partition, though nobody else seemed to have a solution to partition at that stage either. So certainly his own skill and his sense of a vision and a political path is crucially important. But he has to keep winning elections too, and there is something of the cult of personality around Eamon de Valera. I mean, the slogan was Up Dev. And much is built around De Valera, but he's such a polarizing figure. For all of those who loved him, there were many who loathed him and couldn't forgive him for what they regarded as his responsibility, his personal responsibility for the Civil War, even though that was a wild exaggeration. Nonetheless, De Valera is polarizing, but he has enough political support to be able to stay in power as long as he did. And of course, Britain is struggling, there's no doubt about that, particularly in the post-Second World War period with regard to its role in international affairs. And advantage can be taken of that from an Irish perspective, but not to the extent that they can end the partition of Ireland.
I want to turn to the kind of historiography of De Valera that you've just started to mention, how he's been viewed in Ireland after his political career. His legacy is disputed, it is controversial. Ireland was obviously a very devout Catholic country the whole way through De Valera's life, in a way that arguably it's not to the same extent now. And De Valera has almost become a personification of that Catholicism, that piety. He's often viewed as this, in austere, pious figure. I know you take a slightly different view to that, Diarmaid. Why don't you agree wholly with that perception of him?
Eamon de Valera was pious and in some respects was austere during a pious and austere era. He's very much of his time. He's been described by Joe Lee, a great Irish historian, as the last of the great Victorians. And when you look at the kind of vision that he articulated, particularly in his most famous broadcast, 1943, The Ireland That We Dreamed Of. It's framed in the past tense, but he does articulate that notion of the rural idyll, and a people who would be content with frugal comfort, and a people who prized spiritual and cultural values over material values. I mean, that was scant comfort for those who had to emigrate throughout the 1950s and those who experienced really tough times economically. But there's also his own personal devoutness when it came to religion. 93% of the population of the new Free State in the early 1920s were Catholic, So it's a very monocultural society, mono-religious society, and that can be quite suffocating, and De Valera is very much associated with that. At the same time, if you dig deep into the archive of Eamon de Valera, you can see that he was determined that there would be a separation between church and state in some crucial respects. He didn't allow the Catholic Church to get its way on everything. It suited successive governments, including his predecessors, to allow the church to step into the vacuum that existed after the Civil War when it came to education, when it came to the provision of social services, when it came to the power of religious institutions. In some respects, the church was like a state within a state, and De Valera didn't want to interfere too much with that. And yet, at the same time, when it came to the framing of his constitution of 1937, which is the constitution we have to this day, he was not accepting the pressure that was being put on him by John Charles McQuaid, who was an advisor to him and ultimately became the most powerful Catholic Archbishop of Dublin in the 20th century. He wouldn't accept his advice to declare Catholicism the state religion. De Valera wanted Ireland to be seen as a state that would respect minority religions. And, the 1937 Constitution is a significant human rights document as well. And it does, of course, contain the separation of powers too, between judicial and judicial life and political life. So, De Valera's constitution is a reflection of its time, but it also has liberal elements. De Valera liked to try and manage tensions behind the scenes, prevent them becoming full church-state clashes, for example, and that required considerable political skill also. But at the same time, De Valera is in power during an era when the church had far too much power. We've learned an awful lot in the last 20 or 30 years about the scale of the power that the church had and the abuse of the power that the church had. That will forever be associated with De Valera's Ireland, as it should be. But it's about a whole host of power alliances and socio-moral attitudes. And there's a danger, I suppose, of using De Valera as a shorthand for all of these difficult issues, and to make these sweeping assertions about De Valera's Ireland, which, like all sweeping assertions, don't contain the nuance and the layers that is required for proper historical scrutiny. So, I mean, the historiography, I suppose, reflects that to a degree. There were some very amusing satires when I was growing up about Eamon de Valera as the killjoy, as somebody who stayed well beyond his political sell-by date, which arguably he did. I mean, you mentioned his longevity. He came into public life in 1913. He retired as President of Ireland in 1973. He has a 60-year public life, which is mind-boggling. And not necessarily a positive when you consider that his best political days are behind him by the 1940s. So you do have to consider the idea of him staying on too long. And De Valera was also associated particularly with attitudes to women. There's a clause in the 1937 Constitution about a woman's life in the home, without which the common good cannot be achieved, which angered feminists or some international women's organisations and Irish women's organisations in the 1930s. And that, again, is very much a reflection of his belief in the place of women. But it was widely shared in Ireland, not least by the women themselves. And that needs to be acknowledged. There's a temptation for us, of course, to impose 21st century values on the 1930s and the 1940s, which doesn't do justice to the politicians of that era.
I think, in short, what you're saying is that as he lingered, his legacy has perhaps lingered as well, and there's a sense that he has probably outstayed his welcome by the later part.
Well, there is. And I mean, he's also, it was interesting during the period of the Celtic Tiger economy in Ireland in the late 1990s, and a sense of excess. And there were criticisms of the shortcomings of contemporary politicians for not being able to articulate a coherent vision of Irish society. And some people had invoked Eamon de Valera's name in that vein. You know, somebody who knows where they want to take the country and has a sense of values and knows the importance of bonds between communities and different generations. Now, you could argue that that's a romanticisation. Perhaps it is. But it's also, I suppose, an indication of a different era in politics. Where politicians don't seem to stand for an awful lot. You know, there doesn't seem to be too much there ideologically when you go digging. So his name could be invoked in that sense. But inevitably, for somebody who dominates politics for so long, their reputation is going to take a battering. And you could compare Eamon de Valera to Salazar in Portugal or de Gaulle in France. And even when himself and Winston Churchill were sparring in the 1940s, I mean, in a sense, both of those individuals had much in common. They both came to represent the respective destinies of their nations in the early 1940s. They eventually met each other in the early 1950s, the first time they'd met in person, and they kind of reminisced about the old days, and they talked about all of their contemporaries who had long left politics or left this life, and you know, they were the elder statesmen looking back. So, you know, politicians can and did stay around too long.
I just have three more questions for you.
It's okay, take your time. Yeah.
Okay. It's worth noting, obviously, that Catholicism has declined in Ireland at the same time as the country has become a lot wealthier, sort of after the 80s and 90s. Do you think that there's an interplay between those two trends? And if so, is one phenomenon driving the other?
I remember waking up on a morning in 1992 and reading the headline that Ireland's best known and most popular Catholic bishop had been exposed as leading a double life. You know, that he was a father and that he had been paying sums of money for the education of his son in New York. And in some respects, that was the beginning of a period of revelations about double lives. And it got much, much worse, particularly in relation to child abuse. And I'm not linking the Bishop of Galway to that. But the 1990s became a decade of revelations. And on it went. So that was part of it. I suppose there were those who were emboldened to dig deeper in order to see if the Catholic Church had been living up to its own rhetoric and its own words and its own piety, and found that they fell well short. That's part of it. There's also generational change. That's crucial too. People who were the beneficiaries of the expansion in education, who were not carrying the pieties of the previous generation, of their parents and of their grandparents, who were making up their own minds about things. But there was still an extraordinary level of allegiance to the Catholic Church when I was growing up in the 1970s and the 1980s, and mass attendance rates were over 80%, which in international terms was phenomenally high. And that's still the case in the early 1990s in many parts of the country. But their credibility takes such a battering. And that does combine, too, with economic expansion and a sense of an Ireland that is certainly is not as poor as it was, but also is increasingly globalised, is increasingly connected, and is communicating in different ways, and is embracing more secular ideas. You know, it's not a uniquely Irish phenomenon, but it's particularly pronounced in Ireland because it was so Catholic for so long, and so monocultural and so monoreligious for so long. So it really is a combination. The loss of deference is the big theme there. An awful lot of the church's power was built on deference, and it was deference that was commanded and demanded, and it begins to dissipate. very dramatically. But it's also about the rise of the women's movement. And I would go further back. This isn't just about the 1980s and the 1990s. The Irish women's liberation movement emerged in the late 1960s. It was an Irish manifestation of what was happening internationally. The debate about contraception becomes one that cannot be contained any longer. You know, the Criminal Law Amendment Act from 1935, from the De Valera's Ireland period, which prohibited the sale and importation of contraception. You know, that debate can't be contained. It's legally challenged. It's found to be unconstitutional in the early 1970s. There's a whole succession of legal challenges in the 1970s that do damage, I suppose, to some of the architecture of De Valera's Ireland. So, I mean, that change can be rooted in earlier decades. That combined then with all of the revelations of the 1990s and beyond really did huge damage to the Catholic Church. And it's never going to recover the power that it had, the prestige that it had. And it's also an aging institution, as it is in other parts. So it doesn't have the capacity to be able to control and run institutions that it did in the past.
Just to turn to politics, Diarmaid, Ireland's two big political parties, as you said, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, were forged out of the treaty disagreement. But in modern Irish politics, they don't seem to offer a great deal of difference in terms of economic policy. That's the way it seems as an outsider looking in, anyway. And that economics really has been the issue, the area over which political parties in the West kind of divide themselves. You generally have a party for Labour coming from the left and another for Capital, you know, on the right. But the way I've understood it is that both of the Fianna parties are essentially centre-right in orientation, in their kind of economic view of the world. Firstly, am I correct in that perception? And secondly, if that is correct, does it sit oddly with you as an Irish person?
It doesn't sit oddly with me because I've known nothing else. This is what I grew up with. This is what I'm living with now. There isn't a cigarette paper of difference between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael when it comes to the fundamental questions. They would both dispute the description centre-right. Many would maintain that they're centre-left. Fianna Fáil in particular would argue that historically, you know, they had more of a tendency towards state intervention and a welfare agenda than Fine Gael, and they would argue that difference. But of course, what happened in recent years is that the two of them came to share power, and ultimately Civil War politics came to that formal end by them going into coalition government together along with the Green Party, which is an illustration of more recent priorities. But you've got to think about the big fundamental questions around which they coalesced and agreed, even when they were on opposite sides of Parliament. They agreed about the imperative, compelling reason to join the European Economic Community in 1973. They agreed about Irish neutrality going further back. So they were agreed on fundamental foreign policy priorities. They came to agreement too on economic policy, on opening up the Irish economy, you know, breaking down the protected Irish economy and making it a small, open economy that became so globalized. There's no disagreement with them in relation to that. So, you know, there was no disagreement between them when it came to the need to try and defeat the IRA, which of course didn't disappear at the end of the Civil War. And they had a shared approach to these fundamental questions about the security of the state. And we've got to acknowledge the extraordinary achievement of Ireland over the last 100 years. It's an unbroken 100 years of democracy. There are very few states that can make that boast. Ireland can. Both of them shared that fundamental commitment to democracy and the importance of the institutions of the state. And that served Ireland well. It was stable. It may have been stagnant and it may have been problematic in all sorts of ways, but that endured. That commitment to democracy, and the democracy endured. And given the convulsions internationally, in particular of the 1930s, that was no small achievement, you know. But they were divided on issues that, as you mentioned, don't necessarily apply to other European countries at this time. That made Ireland a very interesting case study for political scientists over the years about the extent to which the Civil War divisions dominated Irish politics, to the point where the two main political parties could command over 80% of the vote between them, up to relatively recent decades, without there really being much ideological differences between them.
Finally then, de Valera died in 1975. What would he think of the Ireland of today, a century after independence?
Well, we have a secret ballot, of course, so we don't know this for certain, but I strongly suspect that Eamon de Valera voted against Ireland joining the European Economic Community. Now, why is that relevant? De Valera, as I mentioned, wanted to guide Irish foreign policy. He also wanted to make use of the League of Nations in the 1930s to make the case for smaller states having a say in international affairs. And he used that forum in order to strongly voice that idea of the relevance of the voice of the smaller nations. He was very worried about the idea of Ireland being swallowed up by a large international organisation, which the EEC was. So I suspect he voted against EEC membership. And of course, he was coming towards the end of his political career and indeed his life at that stage. So it didn't matter a huge amount. But I imagine that he would have been very concerned about the idea of an ever-increasing European Union, both in size and power, and what that might mean for the independence of a small nation. Of course, you can speculate about the extent to which he would have seen that as a betrayal of an independent foreign policy. He would be concerned, of course, today about the degree to which there is vigorous debate about Irish neutrality. Irish neutrality is very much associated with Eamon de Valera, and given the era that we are living through now, there are questions being raised about the viability and the appropriateness and the morality of Irish neutrality. And is Ireland ultimately going to become part of a European defence arrangement or a defence agreement? And what will the implications be for Ireland's traditional neutral status? That's a legacy, partly a legacy of the de Valera era too. There's still a lot of Irish attachment to neutrality. So he would certainly be exercised about that. He'd also be concerned, of course, about the status of the party that he established in April 1926. Fianna Fáil was trounced in 2011 as a result of its appalling failures that led to the economic crash. That was an international crash, but there was also a domestic mismanagement of politics and the economy. And Fianna Fáil took a hammering, their worst election result in 2011. And given what I've mentioned, the success of Fianna Fáil over the decades, that reduced them to a rump. Now they have recovered, but they certainly haven't recovered on the scale that they had hoped. They certainly haven't recovered to the point where they could govern alone. And of course, what's happening now is that Sinn Féin is the most popular political party currently in opposition, but looks like it could be in a very commanding position after the next general election. So I'm sure Eamon de Valera would have had plenty of thoughts about the demise of Fianna Fáil and the rise of the new Sinn Féin. De Valera would also be very disappointed that over 100 years after the creation of the border on the island of Ireland, it's still there. The same border, of course, the debate around the border has changed, but the fundamental existence of a partitioned Ireland, I think, would cause great pain to Eamon de Valera. So I think in relation to a variety of different areas, he would be concerned and disappointed. And yet, could you argue that he could also see an Ireland that had become much more prosperous, an Ireland that had found its voice at home and internationally in different ways, and perhaps ways that he hadn't envisaged. But again, in a way, you're dragged back to the idea of the last of the great Victorians. Would he not have been concerned about the extent to which material concerns drove so much activity in Ireland? So there's a variety of different things there to ponder. I do remember at the height of the economic crisis in 2010 being asked to deliver a lecture, is Eamon de Valera turning in his grave? So it was a question that was being asked, partly because Ireland was seen to effectively lose its sovereignty in 2010 as a result of the economic bankruptcy of the state, the emergence of a troika to essentially manage and dictate our affairs. And that was regarded as very humiliating. And that's when Eamon de Valera's name was invoked, that this was someone so strongly associated with Irish independence and with Irish sovereignty, that to experience that kind of humiliation where you are no longer seen to be controlling your own destiny, that would ultimately have been the thing that would have had him spinning in his grave.
Diarmaid, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this. Where can people find your work if they want to find out more about de Valera or about Irish history? Profile books in London. Okay, thank you very much, Diarmaid. Cheers.
Pleasure to talk to you, Tom.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.